So what did we see in the very last in our very last session? We just saw the how Sanatana Dharma as a religious concept, how it views human history. I think you can go to the next slide. So we'll have a recap. I think you can switch to the next slide. I don't know why the slide isn't switching. Pratik? Yeah, previous slide, previous slide, previous slide. You came too forward. Yeah, okay. So we saw the origin of the word Hindu. Some medieval texts use this word. It's a geographical term. It has almost nothing from the religious point of view. In fact, religiously, it does not classify the people calling themselves Hindu into any one bucket. It meanders off into all the people who live within this kind of an area. So Sharngadara Paddhati says something like between Sindhu River, Himalayas, and the seas to the south, whoever lives there, that person's a Hindu. Whereas Bharhaspatya Samhita also says something very similar to that effect, that people living within that the rough region bounded by Himalayas, Sindhu River, and the seas to the south, that place is known as the land of the Hindus. Yeah, go to the next slide. So we also saw the Yuga concept, the Yugas and Kalpas and how they go forward. The idea of how for us there is no single start, a definitive start to any history, but these things just keep going on and on because creation and destruction keep happening in cycles. We recognize multiple lokas and various beings on those lokas also having their own respective histories running in parallel to us. Yeah, Pratik, you can go to the next slide. Pratik, go to the next slide. Okay, anyways, I don't know why there's a problem on Pratik's end. Anyways, we'll continue today. So what we are going to see today is what we call as Kaliyuga, between 5 and 6,000 years ago, how this period began, what is our view of it, what exactly was the kind of situation and society in general that was there in Bharatavarsha at that particular point of time, and what do Sanatani sources, Vedavyasa's Pramana, what does it say about it? What is? Please keep yourselves muted. I really don't want any disturbance. It's kind of ruining the recording. Vedavyasa's Pramana say about it, and various other non-scriptural sources also that we are going to be exploring today. So we'll go into the beginning of this period, which has largely only sources from Mahabharata and Bhagavata Purana. So the very beginning that the very beginning of this period, attributably we have as Sanatanis, as people who believe Vedavyasa to be the preceptor guru, there are very few handpicked sources that can tell you anything about and in the period of time that started with this particular age called Kali. So Mahabharata, in fact, talks about certain. It shows you certain kinds of rulers, especially the so-called Kshatriya rulers. It shows you vividly through the Sabha Parva specifically, and from the Sabha Parva onwards. That was after the Sabha Parva's beginning, after the second book of the 18 books of Mahabharata, from the beginning of the Sabha Parva to the very end. It shows you roughly what are the kind of rulers that will rule across Kali Yuga. Pratik, if you are having a problem with the changing the slides, please disconnect slide sharing and reconnect because it's still stuck on the same slide. I'm not able to really see any change in the slides. You need to keep moving forward. If you have a problem, just disconnect and reconnect. So one of the rulers that occurs to the very beginning of Mahabharata, who kind of forms a sort of a template that would be followed, sort of a character template for all the rulers at the beginning of this era called Kali. One of the very interesting rulers in Mahabharata is this man called Jarasandha. Now, what is the point of Jarasandha? What is the exact the reason why Jarasandha is discussed in our scriptures is that Jarasandha is the sort of person who would ensure a lot of external prosperity for his kingdom, but he would basically abandon the following of the four Vedas. He would abandon the four Vedas, but he'd externally ensure a lot of material prosperity for his kingdom. In his kingdom, you would see a very high standard of living. People would externally be very happy to look at, but the proceeds of that prosperity comes from loot that he has gathered from various sources, from various kingdoms. He has literally plundered many places. He has razed cities to the ground. He has completely decimated populations and he has taken wealth from them. And he feeds his population on that wealth, and that's his claim to success and fame. So Magadha in those days is that kind of a kingdom under this particular ruler. Now, Jarasandha that gives you a very early idea as to what would happen once we come into the 5,000, 6,000 year bracket, which we are observing now. Most rulers across Bharatavarsha, at least, and its periphery, would follow Jarasandha's uh, thought process when it came to ruling, when it came to administering, when it came to even following religions. So Jarasandha's religious views, if you see, were not very different from the kind of religious views we saw even 2000 years ago across Bharatavarsha, or the kind of religious views that were predominant in the Mauryan Empire. Jarasandha was a sort of man who he claimed to be some kind of a Shaiva, some kind of a tantric Shaiva he claimed to be. His practices included even conducting human sacrifices. Jarasandha was a man of extreme convenience. So this person, he'd follow anything that would give him momentarily a little more power over his enemies. He kind of he's described as a very unscrupulous ruler, but the way he used to make military alliances is kind of interesting because Jarasandha's military allies consisted of these slave kings who ruled these small fiefdoms and cantons, most of whom Krishna and Balarama eventually killed. But these rulers basically were rulers of these smaller kingdoms whose armies were pretty much enslaved by Jarasandha. So their armies were for most of the time outside of their kingdoms, roaming all over Bharatavarsha, committing conquests for him. He never really had an idea of honoring any treaty that he signed. He never had this concept of we need to have autonomy for our rulers. He never really had any such concept that people should self-govern within his kingdom. Just give me a second. So this was a person who for all intents and purposes, even his political ethics went very, very against what you call Yuddha Dharma and Manushastra. So if you observe rulers like Shantanu or if you observe rulers like Pandu, they ruled as confederacies where one ruler would command military alliances, but in peacetime, all his subordinate vassal rulers would be left independent to rule their kingdom, and as long as they followed certain basic criteria set down by their overlord, something like they'd have to follow certain basic tenets of Manushastra. They cannot indulge in certain kinds of activities, even if they did before they came under his rule. They'll have to pay a tribute to him, and they'll have to allow passage of his troops through the lands. So Jarasandha went against all of this. And Jarasandha was the sort of man who it kind of became very obvious that once Jarasandha is gone, what kind of people are going to rule over Bharatavarsha. Next, when we come to Duryodhana's and Karna's regime, and the Pandavas were effectively in exile. Much of the period of time where the Pandavas were in exile, those 13 years of exile, Karna and Duryodhana, they the entirety of the Vanaparva system, Karna and Duryodhana had reduced Bharatavarsha to some level of anarchy where no stable military alliance had existed over there at that time. So you did not have any of these defensive protective alliances that Yudhishthira or Pandu had created. It was pretty much every kingdom for itself. You had a lot of petty banty raiding, looting. You had you had a lot of drought and famine in those days, and back in those days you had particularly rulers like Karna and Duryodhana going around all of Bharatavarsha and except maybe a few parts like Matsya, Panchala, and perhaps you can say Dwarka, leaving these three or four places relatively untouched. Most of Bharatavarsha was fairly desertified by them. By the time Yudhishthira came back to reclaim his kingdom, what Vyasa describes is that there really was there was no uniformity of law across the land which Yudhishthira had ensured before his exile had begun. So, just give me a second. Yeah. So the social landscape of Bharatavarsha uh, was one where a lot of religious practices under the regime of Duryodhana had practically died out, because when you see Duryodhana coming and boasting in the stadium that the four Varnas are just a lie that has been cooked up by the Vedas, this is just for social control, and I really don't believe in any of this. There exists no God. When he does this in Adi Parva, Vyasa says that a lot of people in that stadium actually cheered him. And that is not really surprising, because when you think about the era that we'll be discussing in question over here, majority of Bharatavarsha started embracing those kinds of beliefs. So, in order to understand how Kaliyuga actually began, the 5,000, 6,000 year bracket that we are looking at, how it began, you will have to look at the end of the Mahabharata. In Duryodhana's time, it started becoming a norm to, in fact, in many parts of Bharatavarsha, it became a norm to, in fact, abandon even the basic morals that Vedavyasa talks about, that the four varnas followed under dharmic rulers. Uh, Things like tantric sorcery became very, very rampant across all of the kingdoms that more allied more with the Kauravas. You had even Duryodhana indulging in such things like sorcery, what we'll call as Vamachara. We'll discuss that a little more in detail, how that exactly works, why that exists, what is the Sanatani view on those kinds of religious practices. Atheism was something that had started becoming mainstream among ruling circles at the end of Dwapara Yuga. That was it was not very common to find it was not very uncommon to find an atheist back in those days. And lastly, the idea of having to marry within one's own varna, the idea of maintaining one's varna, the idea of following what one's forefathers followed, that also started kind of going on the decline uh, in all of Bharatavarsha at the end of Dwapara Yuga. Now, what we see in the Bhagavata Purana, we know a little out of Mahabharata. What we see in the Bhagavata Purana is that Vyasa describes when uh, when Kshatriyas stopped being Kshatriyas, what exactly happened? And Vyasa also tells you that in Kali Yuga, by the era of he even names the era of the Mauryas in the Bhagavata Purana. He actually calls the Mauryas by name and he says the dynasty that precedes the Mauryas, that will be the last generation of real Kshatriyas. Now, what does Vyasa say happens to the Kshatriyas? Now, obviously, the descendants, the bloodline, the people who came in those families, they still exist. But Vyasa says that once Kshatriyas stop wearing their Yagnopavita, once Kshatriyas start abandoning the Vedic way of life that has been prescribed for them in the Manushastra, they stop being Kshatriyas. He calls them by various names. Some names are like some of the names that he mentions in book 12 of the Bhagavata Purana include Madraka. He mentions a group of people called Pulinda. Now, Pulinda is a group of tribes that occur in the periphery of Bharatavarsha in the Mahabharata itself. Some of these tribes are allied with the Kauravas, some of these tribes are allied with the Pandavas. Pulindas are basically Mostly those people whose forefathers were Kshatriyas who abandoned being Kshatriyas. They abandoned the ways of the Kshatriyas. They don't live among they don't live among Chaturvarnya, although in certain kingdoms of the Pulindas, such as the kingdom of a king known as Subahu, who ruled somewhere that roughly corresponds to the region covered by modern day Mount Kailasa. In that particular region, where King Subahu lived, Vedavyasa says that because this person was a person who respected Sanatana Dharma despite being a Pulinda, being a person of Pulinda lineage, and because this was a person who also valued his military alliance with Yudhishthira, he also greatly valued being an ally of Krishna. He allowed Chaturvarnya, that is, people of the four Varnas, to live in his land. He allowed people of those Varnas to practice their tenets in his land, but nothing more is told about what this person was like. Vyasa again speaks in Bhagavata Purana about, apart from talking about the morality of the rulers who abandon Kshatriyatva, what he stresses on is that they will start embracing those religions that go outside of the four Vedas, people who abandon their Kshatriyatva. Now, that is kind of where we start with the era called Kaliyuga. When rulers start abandoning what has been set for them in the four Vedas, that is effectively the beginning of Kali Yuga, where we see the very beginning of Kali Yuga itself. Almost all the events that occur at the very start of this 5,000, 6,000 timeline, you will find a total silence regarding the very start of that period, both in Bhagavata Purana and in Mahabharata. You will just have certain rough sketches of how rulers who are remaining at the beginning of Kali in Bharatavarsha, they go progressively bad. But then when you step inside Kali Yuga, you have a lot of these non-scriptural sources, some of which are listed on your screen today. Some of these non-scriptural sources that actually start giving you a very good demonstration of what Vedavyasa speaks of. Vedavyasa, he only tells you a rough guideline of what will become of society. But where do you actually get to see at a street level what happened on a day-to-day basis to these rulers, what happened in the cities? You have no choice but to get into non-scriptural sources. Now, non-scriptural sources are of various kinds. We have certain Shaiva lores, like we have a compilation of texts known as Periya Puranam. Now, Periya Puranam was written only about 800 years ago. And this text was written by a Shaiva poet in in the modern day Tamil Nadu. That time it was the Pandya kingdom. His name was Sekirar. Now, Sekirar describes the lives of various ancient Shaiva saints who are collectively known as the Nayanmars. I'll get into that in a little while. When Sekirar gets into the lives of the Nayanmars, this one particular source, you have to know certain peculiarities about it. It's not exactly a scriptural source. That is, he did not intend it to be exactly a scripture. He intended it to be more a biography, a series of biographies. So the thing about Sekirar's work, the peculiarity is that it will have a level of political bias. It will have a level of he will mix certain anachronistic things. So some of the things he says will not be a perfect reflection of the timeline he's talking about. He will say, I'm talking about 4,000 years ago, but he actually mixed a lot of things from 800 years ago with the 4,000-year-old history, and he narrated to you. So you have to be really aware of the kind of authors whom we are going to see. Sekirar is one such author. Now, if you see the author of Manimekalai, it is said that an author known as Seetalai Satana compiled this text known as Manimekalai, but none of these works, whether it's Periyapuranam or Sekidar, or whether it's Manimekalai, or whether it's any of these other lores, none of them will be entirely, you can't take them at face value, because it will mix a lot of the authors who lived hundreds of years after these events would end up mixing some of their own life events in that book, or they would end up mixing some of their own social events in those works. While at the same time, it won't be 100% false also. There'll be a lot of truth to it, because at the end of the day, these authors themselves spent a lot of time going from place to place in their own time, gathering these lores, these prominent lores that were prominently present in that time. So once we get to know the identities of authors, we also should be very, very aware of the kind of bias that they would have put in. Now, if we look at a book called Mahavamsa, whose overview we'll be looking today, that book is totally it's a book that completely portrays the history of Buddhism, early Buddhism, from the eyes of Buddhist monks who compiled this work. Now, when you look at Mahavamsa, the peculiarity of this book is that it will also have a lot of anachronistic things in it. It will tell you some things that occurred supposedly during Ashoka's life, which you don't find anywhere else. It will also tell you the occurrences of certain events that probably occurred over, say, a 500-year time span, but it will talk about those events as if they occurred within just a few years. It will ignore some events that are very, very inconvenient to acknowledgement, because if those things were acknowledged openly, then it would have been very embarrassing for early Theravada Buddhism. It would also tell you certain realities of the then Buddhist society in a very embellished way. It would basically try to make up certain events that you can't find corroboration for it anywhere else. Like it will talk about uh, discrimination against people of other varnas by brahmanas, which you will never find in any other source, any other Buddhist source also of its own time. So when Mahavamsa speaks about, say, there were these Buddhists who lived around Varanasi who observed that the brahmanas of that land and of Mathura indulged in a certain kind of activity. If you go into the Madhura Sutta, which was authored pretty much in those lands around Varanasi, around Mathura, etc., that sutta will never tell you about those same things. Likewise, if you look into a text like Ashoka Vadana, where Pushyamitra Shunga's activities are described in a certain way by the Buddhist authors who authored Ashoka Vadana, Mahavamsa does not corroborate any of it. The reason why I'm getting into this is when we are going to look at these sources, we need to be very mindful of the kind of biases these authors themselves will start putting into these sources. That being said, we have now a broad picture of how Kali began. Kali pretty much began with the dilution of Sanatana Dharma from what Vedavyasa shows in Mahabharata. So Mahabharata's conclusion. So there are two high points in the Mahabharata. One high point is the Bhagavad Gita, in which Krishna pretty much summarizes how a Sanatani's viewpoint should be. How Sanatana Dharman's viewpoint itself should be at the end of the day. He talks about Sharanagati. He tells you that other devas are not worthy of worship itself. That is again corroborated across the entire Mahabharata. When Hanuman meets Bhima, Hanuman says there used to be an era when no Sanatana Dharmin used to worship anyone other than Sriman Narayana. And then came Treta Yuga when they wanted more material boons. Like, okay, in Krita Yuga, people were Prapannas who wanted Vaikuntha Gati. So it was more it was more frequent that you'd see a human undertaking Vaishnava Prapatti. But then came Treta Yuga when they were more interested in getting flying carpets, magic tricks, these kinds of inferior boons from devas, and so they started doing penances to other devas. Then came Dwapara Yuga. Dwapara Yuga was the era where the abandonment of, or you can say rather, the cherry-picked dilution of the four Vedas became kind of a mainstream vogue, as well as the concepts of atheism, the concepts of Gnosticism, concepts like Bauddha, Jaina, etc. They started coming in Dwapara Yuga. The end of Dwapara, which marks the beginning of Kali, is pretty much where Dharma has only one leg to stand on. So when you start the history of Kali Yuga, you have to always know that you will only be seeing half dharmic people or adharmic people who will be guiding most of society, and the ideals of Sanatana Dharma as preached by Vedavyasa and Mahabharata particularly, they kind of become more and more alien to the human society that develops not just in Bharatavarsha but generally across the earth. So in the beginning of this 5,000, 6,000 year range, you can broadly classify all humans itself from the point of view of Vedavyasa into three brackets. You have Vaidikas of two kinds and Avaidikas, that is only one kind. When I say Vaidikas of two kinds, one must be very mindful of the fact what kind of Vaidikas both are, what are the differences, and why these two kinds of Vaidikas existed. One is the Vaishnava Vaidika and one is the Shaiva Vaidika. When we talk about the Vaishnava Vaidika, Vaishnava Vaidikas are visible even today. Shaiva Vedikas are also visible today, albeit in a very different sense in comparison to what you saw in the beginning of this 5,000, 6,000 year gap at the beginning of this age. The Vaishnava Vedikas who exist today, the Sampradayas like Vishishtadvaita, that is Sri Vaishnava, Madhva, Nimbarka, these kinds of ideologies and philosophies existed back then also. You had people like, you had acharyas like Dramidacharya, you had various acharyas. You in the Mahabharata itself, you see Bhishma. What Bhishma makes a very, very long speech in Sabha Parva, asking the Kauravas to acknowledge the identity of Krishna. If you take any of the contemporary, any of the present day Vaishnava Sampradayas, everyone knows that Bhishma had done Prapatti to Sriman Narayana. But if you take any of the contemporary, any of the present day Vaishnava schools core philosophies, and if you compare it with the long sermon that Bhishma gives in Hastinapura and Sabha Parva, you will see that the entire thing matches with what you call Vishishta Advaita. You will have various aspects of Vaishnavism broadly coming across the Mahabharata. If you see Sanat Sujata Muni's discourse to Dhritarashtra and Udyoga Parva, again, Sanat Sujata Muni's discourse is crafted in such a way that Muni will say some things which, in case you are not acquainted with Sharira Shariri Bhava as expounded by Vedanta Desika, Manavala Mamrigal, Ramanujacharya, etc., Natha Muni, and the 11 Alvars, you really wouldn't be able to make out what he's trying to say. Sanat Sujata Muni will say a number of things in that discourse about the nature of Sriman Narayana, about the nature of the Jivatman, about Vaikuntha. He will say some things. You can very easily make out over there that the philosophies that you call Vaishnavism in present day were very much existent even in those days. Now, when you say Shaiva philosophies, the same philosophies that existed at the end of Mahabharata in the Shaiva schools, they exist even today. However, the form in which they exist in present day is slightly different. We will see what kind of people, what kind of people Shaiva schools, what kind of schools the Shaiva schools generally are, and what kind of schools Vaishnava schools are. These two schools call themselves Vaidika schools. Now, there is a reason for this. The name itself suggests that both the broad umbrella terms Vaishnava Vaidika and Shaiva Vaidika, both of them claim that they follow the four Vedas. The Vaishnava Vaidika, they follow the Vedas verbatim, as it is. I'm not going into which school of Vaishnavism we're talking about. I'm not going into whether it's Madhva or whether it's, in those days, of course, Madhvacharya didn't exist 5,000 years ago, but Dvaita school existed. Ramanuja didn't exist for 5,000 years ago, but Vishishtadvaita existed. Vallabhacharya did not exist 5,000 years ago, but Shuddhadvaita existed. The schools existed. The founders whom we associate themselves, those schools with today, they didn't exist. The ideologies existed. Now, I'm not going to go into which ideology. I'm just broadly classifying. Vaishnavism is one umbrella term. The commonalities between all these, despite the subtle differences, are they all acknowledge Sriman Narayana as the supreme almighty being that doesn't have any birth or any death, or this being is eternally perfect. It's not going to ever change. This being has various shariras. This being is the reason why Jivatmans are being sustained. This being is the reason why samsara is being sustained. And this is the being that is going to ultimately give Jivatman Mukti and Vaikuntha Gati. This is common between all Vaishnava philosophies, irrespective of what they are. From a scriptural point of view, all Vaishnava philosophies follow the Vedas as is. Now, how does the Shaiva Vaidika differ from this? The Shaiva Vaidika of that era, I'm talking about of 5,000, 6,000 years ago. Some of those Shaiva schools are extinct today. Some of the schools that existed back then, they would tell you the same thing. They'd say we also follow the Vedas as is. However, the Shaivas had something known as Shaiva Agama or Shaiva Upanishad. Now, Shaiva Upanishad is not the same as the Upanishads that you popularly know. Upanishads like Chandogya Upanishad, Mandukya Upanishad. It's not like those Upanishads at all. Shaiva Upanishads are a separate series of scriptures which Shaiva schools believe was handed down to them by Shiva himself. They don't occur within the Vedas. Now, the difference between a Shaiva Upanishad and the regular Upanishad is that the regular Upanishad is a part of the Vedas itself. If you take Taittiriya Upanishad, it is part of the Yajurveda. It will be inside the Yajurveda. It has to be recited in the same swara as how you recite Yajurveda and the same pitch in which Yajurveda is recited. If you take Rigveda, inside the Chandogya Upanishad comes. It will be recited in the same way all Rig mantras and all are recited. The only exception to this rule is probably Bhagavad Gita, which is called an Upanishad, but it doesn't exist within any of the Vedas. It exists within an Itihasa Mahabharata. But it's called an Upanishad because it does the exact function of an Upanishad and it came from Bhagavan himself. It's called an Upanishad for that reason. Now, the Shaiva Upanishad, you will not see whatever lines you see in a Shaiva Upanishad, you will not see those lines in the four Vedas. That's a separate set of Upanishads. Okay. Now, what are these Shaiva Upanishads? You have a number of them. How many of them? Let's see. Approximately 13. Akshamalika Upanishad, Atharvashika, Atharvashiras, Bhasma Upanishad, Brihajjabala, Dakshinamurti Upanishad, Ganapati Upanishad, Jabali Upanishad, Kalavini Upanishad, Kaivalya Upanishad, Panchabrahma Upanishad, Rudra Hridaya Upanishad, Sharabha Upanishad. These don't occur within the four Vedas. Now, what's the point of these Upanishads is that a Shaiva would tell you that they will accept the Vedas insofar as they'll accept those parts of the four Vedas which align with these Upanishads. Those parts of the four Vedas that don't align with these Upanishads, they will either not give too much importance to that part, or they will have some other way of reasoning that part. So Shaiva Vaidikas are those Vaidikas who accept the Vedas insofar as they correspond to these Agamas. They have that catch. Back in the day, people at a societal level wouldn't be able to distinguish between these schools very easily, because even today, I mean, if you go and ask someone, can you identify whether that person's a Madhva or whether Sri Vaishnava or whether they are Pushti Marga Vallabhacharya followers, you would really not be able to do it unless you're a scholar. You know exactly how to identify that person. Back in those days also, it was the same thing. You would have Shaiva, you would have Vaishnava. You wouldn't have a lot of people who would be scholarly enough to know this person is this, that person is that. So broadly, when you see Shaivism as an umbrella school, this is the broad definition of Vaidika Shaivism. Shaivas who accept the Vedas at some level. Now, do you have something called an Avaidika Shaiva? You do. They are Tantrikas. They don't go by the four Vedas. Those schools you can find more prevalent within the set of ideologies that are known as Kashmiri Shaivism. Okay, we'll go into all that later on in detail. Now, what is it that an Avaidika Shaiva will do that a Vaidika Shaiva does not do? A Vaidika Shaiva will have certain kinds of rites that a Vaidika Shaiva will find them very sinful in nature. For example, for an Avaidika Shaiva, it will be okay to drink alcohol also on certain times of the year, in certain kinds of rituals. He will worship certain kinds of Shiva Ganas, which are Rakshasic spirits, which a Vaidika Shaiva will not do. He will indulge in certain kinds of acts that a Vaidika Shaiva will not. For example, a Vaidika Shaiva will keep vibhuti on various parts of his body, his arms, his shoulder, his forehead, etc. He will keep vibhuti in three horizontal lines known as Tripundra. Whereas an Avaidika Shaiva will be like an Agori. He will go and roll in ash now. They are Tantrikas. A Vaidika Shaiva will not. He will find the idea of Vamachara, sorcery. He'll find these kinds of things very sinful to do. Whereas an Avaidika Shaiva, for him, it will be kind of part of his life. Practicing sorcery and all will be part of his life. So there itself, you have a distinction within the broad term of Shaivas. So inside the Shaivas itself, one side will call itself Vaidika, one side is Avaidika. Now, when you talk about Avaidikas who are outside of, in general, the Avaidikas in general, we categorized three kinds of people: Vaishnava Vaidika, Shaiva Vaidika, and General Avaidika. General Avaidikas are those people who reject the four Vedas completely. Bauddhas, Jainas, and various other folk religion believers And across the earth, if you're going to see in those days, whichever civilizations, whether in whichever other parts of the world, whatever religions they followed, like the ancient Egyptian religion, the ancient Mesopotamian religion, they will all come under Vedika. So broadly, you had three kinds of people on the earth itself at the beginning of Kaliyuga. Now, we will observe a little bit about who all these. Now we have got an idea of some of their religious beliefs. Now we have to see these religious beliefs. Where do they possibly come from? Did they translate to some kind of social practice? And how did they translate to social practice? Now, when we take a religious tenet, whether it's some form of Shaiva, Vaishnava, some form of Bauddha or Jaina, the tenet need not be perfectly reflected in society. The tenet will say something. For example, Vaishnava tenets will say Vaishnava should eat like this. He should sit like this. He should stand like that. He should bathe at this time of day. He should not bathe in the sea on any day other than a particular day of the month. He should bathe only in the river at the other times of the day. They tell you various things. Okay. Now, this doesn't mean every single Vaishnava is going to be doing this. Likewise for Shaivas also. Doesn't mean that every single Shaiva is going to be doing it. But the philosophy itself is kind of useless. The kind of approach I'll be taking is that the philosophy itself is useless to know if you do not know the social practices, because these philosophies partially translated to social practice or they didn't translate at all in some cases. Now, if you're taking Vaidika Vaishnavas, they lived all over Bharatavarsha. We'll first go into Vaidika Vaishnavas. They lived all over Bharatavarsha. They followed all these the various agamas that have been sanctioned by Veda Vyasa. They followed all of them. There are 108 total Vaishnava agamas, and all of them are in line with the four Vedas. Now we need to make a distinction. What is this agama? When we say that there are four Vedas, and those Vedas will tell you basically the relationship between Jivatma, Paramatma, nature in general, and what is the goal a Jivatman should attain. Broadly speaking, that's what Vedas tell you. They tell it to you in a very different way. But that's what Vedas are meant for. They tell you what's the relation between Jivatma, Paramatma. What should a Jivatman finally attain for? What should it aspire for? What it should attain. Now, if you look at an Agama Shastra, they are basically Shastras that are derived from the four Vedas itself. And they will tell you certain practices and certain physical acts of worship that the followers of that Agama should do in order to reap certain fruits, some spiritual fruits. Presently today, Vaishnavas follow largely two Agamas only. It's either Pancharatra, the Agama that's followed in larger number, or Vaikhanasa, the Agama that's followed in smaller numbers. So most Vaishnava temples today follow one of these two agamas only, largely by and large. So some examples include, if you see the temple at Tirupati follows Vaikhanasa. If you see the temple at Srirangam, it follows Pancharatra. You can't see the difference between these agamas. What are these agamas? They will tell you certain acts of worship. They will tell you that the Purohita in that particular temple should do certain rituals and certain services in a certain way. It will tell you things for every varna of every person. If you are a person who belongs to this particular varna, as far as that agama is concerned, you are allowed to do these kinds of worship that are okay for your varna. If you are a Brahmana and you're going to do Shalagrama Puja, what all kinds of suktas from the Vedas you can recite at that point of time. If you're say if you're a non-Dvija, if you're from the fourth varna, if you're from the Shudra varna, you don't wear a Yagnopavita, and in Apatkala Sthiti, you should take care of a temple. What can be done by you? It will tell you every day, every single day, the Utsava Murti of the temple, in what order it should be taken around. He should be taken around the temple. In what ways, who should sing what kind of mantras in front of the Utsava Murti, how Naivedya of food for the day should be done in front of the Mula Murti as well as the Utsava Murti. During an eclipse, how the temple should be taken care of, a solar eclipse. How should the daily cleaning of the premise take place? What kind of people are allowed? What kind of people are not allowed? Once in every year, once in so many months of every year, certain prayashchitta vidhis have to be carried out across those temples. What kind of prayashchittas are those? These are the kinds of things agamas will tell you. Broadly, these are the kinds of things they'll tell you, and there's always an initiation into that agama. For example, for Sri Vaishnavas have something called Samashrayana. Nimbarkas have their own one initiation rite they have. Madhvas have their own initiation rite. These rites will normally involve wearing the symbol of Bhagavan on your either shoulder, wearing the symbol of Bhagavan on various parts of your body, reciting a particular mantra so many times at such and such time of the day, doing a certain kind of an aradhana, either to Shalagrama or going to a temple and doing it, or doing it for a cow or a bull. It will involve something like this broadly. It should be done every day. Now, Vaishnavas back then were found all over Bharatavarsha across all four Varnas. Typically, who are the acharyas of Vaishnavas? The students of Vedavyasa, whoever Vedavyasa had left behind. You had munis like Galava Muni. Then you had the appearance of Alvars who started coming in the beginning of Kaliyuga itself. They all became the acharyas of the Vaishnava communities. And then you had various less known, some of the names are even lost. In fact, many of the names are lost. Various descendants of the various students who directly learned from Vedavyasa. They maintained unbroken chains of Guru Paramparas, passing down the knowledge of these agamas, these the various interpretations of the Agama, the various methods in which Itihasa Purana the various parts of Itihasa Purana have to be interpreted in line with that philosophy. They followed an unbroken chain of Acharya Shishya Paramparas. They lived all over Bharatavarsha, but there was a very marked migration from the Ganga basin to Kaveri basin at that time. This is corroborated by Bhagavata Purana itself, where Narada says various people, particularly of the Vaishnavas, they will migrate from Ganga basin and come off to the Kaveri basin. So, if one wonders, why is it that the early Vaishnava saints, the Alvars, why did they incarnate along the Kaveri basin? The pramana for that is going to be found in Bhagavata Purana, and this is the reason for that. We can never divorce our scripture completely from the interpretation of history. We cannot and we will not do it. That's the point of these sessions itself. It's history through Sanatana Dharmikais. Now, because the established schools of Vaishnava Dharma were largely at the beginning of Kali Yuga, most of the sages largely migrated to the Kaveri river basin. The Nitya Suris of Mahavishnu incarnated more along the Kaveri river basin only. Now, what's a Nitya Suri? Nitya Suris are those Muktas who live in Vaikuntha who have never been Jivatmas. For example, I am a Jivatma. I have karma phala. I am floating around over here as a human. In my previous life, I don't know, I might have been a dog or a lizard. I have taken infinitely many lifetimes across various unknown number of bodies I've taken, and I've come here. I will aspire to go to Vaikuntha, and I have to leave samsara permanently, the cycle of rebirth, and I have to go to Vaikuntha. My Atman should go to Vaikuntha. This is called a Jivatman becoming a Muktatman. Now, Nityasuris are those Atmans, those Jivatmans that have never been in samsara. They have since eternity been in Vaikuntha. Who are some of these Nityasuris? Garuda, Adisesha, Vishvaksena. The crown that Bhagavan wears on his head, that is also a Nityasuri. Sudarshana. His weapons are also various Nityasuris. These are all Nityasuris. These Nityasuris incarnated in the form of 11 saints known as Alvars. They incarnated in the form of 11 saints known as the Alvars, and they primarily incarnated in that land where the preceptors of Vaishnava Dharma had migrated to from the Ganga river basin, which is why the same Dharma that Krishna preached, Bhishma preached along the Ganga river banks, it started getting preached once again across the first 3000 years or so of Kali Yuga along the banks of the Kaveri, south and north, both banks of the Kaveri. There have been Alvars who journeyed from there to Ayodhya, Mathura, Shalagrama, Muktinath, etc. They have journeyed all over Bharatavarsha. But the reason for their primary incarnation happening over there was this. Now, these Vaishnavas, over a period of time, they also broke off into various schools over a period of time. You cannot put a date to when they broke into various schools. No, it's a misconception to think that Ramanuja created the Sri Vaishnava school. Sri Vaishnava school existed even before Ramanuja. Conception to think that Madhva created that Madhvacharya created the Madhva Dvaita school. It existed even before his time. It's a misconception likewise to think Adi Shankara created the Kevala Dvaita school. It existed before his time also. So the schools of these acharyas existed well before their times. We as Sanatanis won't believe that there ever was a start date, because as far as our Puranas and Itihasas are concerned, Veda Vyasa mentions people like Bauddhas, Jainas, even in Itihasa Purana. When Bauddhas, Jainas, etc. have existed in previous Kalpas, previous Kaliyugas, previous Manvantras, and previous Mahayugas, obviously all the other schools of various other Agamas, etc. have also existed throughout time. So if we ask, since when has, say, the Dvaita school existed, we will say it has existed since forever only. In last Kalpa also it would have been there. In the Kalpa before that also it would have been there. These schools came into existence and at unknown times, and they have always been there, as we are seeing. But they came into prominence only at particular points of time. For example, if it was Nathamuni's time when effectively the school that was known as Sri Vaishnavism started becoming very prominent. Similarly, it was Adi Shankara who made Kevala Dvaita very, very prominent. It was Madhvacharya who made Dvaita very prominent. It was Nimbarka who made Dvaita very prominent. It was Vallabhacharya who made Shuddha Dvaita very prominent. So the preceptor gurus of these various traditions of the Vaishnava Agamas, of the Vaishnava Sampradayas, they only kick-started the prominence of that school. They revitalized and they revived the practice of the traditions of that school. They made those practices trendy and in vogue, and they brought it back into, they made it more famous, they made it more attractive to people. They convinced people that there is something good for you in this, so practice it in large numbers. So in their lifetimes, people started looking at them and practicing it in large numbers. Therefore, they get mistaken as being founders of that school. In reality, they were revivers of that school. That school was going into a decline, or it was not very well known. Its numbers had, it was not about numbers, it was about making the philosophy known. So why did these schools begin? It was never about the numbers. None of these preceptor acharyas ever came with a zeal that I need to get a lot of numbers on my side. That was never a primary goal. It might have happened as a consequence of various events, but it was never a primary goal. The primary goal was, we need to make our philosophy known to the world. Vaishnava Agamas, thus, they existed in this way. They accept the Vedas as is. Now, if you want just an overview of the major Vaishnava Agamas, if you let us start with Vishishtadvaita. Vishishtadvaita is easiest for me to start with because I'm its follower, so it's on the tip of my fingers. I have to think a little for the others. So that's why it's not in any particular order that you need to start narrating this. You can start even with Dvaita, you can start even with Vallabha, you can start with any Sampradaya. Vishishtadvaita basically emphasizes on something called Sharira Shariri Bhava. The Vaishnavas of this school believe that all creation fundamentally are Sharira of Bhagavan, eternally dependent on Bhagavan. They are going to cease to exist had it not been for Bhagavan's pre-existence. Their very existence is only to extol the glory of Bhagavan. And Bhagavan is the sentient being that pervades over them eternally. They reside within Bhagavan. So all of creation resides within Bhagavan, a theme that keeps repeating across Mahabharata. This emphasis on Brihadaranyaka Vishishta Advaita, this is today popularly known as Sri Vaishnavism, Ramanuja school. Then we'll go to the Dvaita school. Now, the Dvaita school basically emphasizes more on the difference between Jivatman and Paramatman. It says Jivatman and Paramatman are completely separate. They also do say that we agree with, in principle, with Brihadaranyaka Sharira Shariri Bhava explanation, but our application of that in daily life is very different. We believe that We also believe that everything is ultimately exists within Bhagavan. Ultimately, everything is going to exist because of Bhagavan. Ultimately, everything is controlled over by Bhagavan. But we also will believe that ultimately everything is different from Bhagavan. And it is the emphasis of our difference that we are a separate Vaishnava tradition in our own right. It is the emphasis of that division between Jivatma and Paramatma. Then you have Shuddha Advaita. Shuddha Advaita basically is that school that believes that Jivatmans are a repressed form of their total whole self. Basically, karma phala, by it reduces the Jivatman's ability from experiencing infinite bliss. And once that karma phala shell is removed and thrown off, it will experience infinite bliss. Therefore, the nature of Jivatman is in reality like the nature of Paramatman. In what sense? In the sense that it can experience infinite ananda, but karma phala reduces it in nature. Therefore, the nature of Jivatman and Paramatman, they are fundamentally non-dualistic in nature. They are very similar. Therefore, they call themselves as Shuddha Advaita. Shuddha Advaita. Their Siddhanta is known as Shuddha Advaita. They also believe in uh, everything exists because of Bhagavan, depends eternally on the existence of Bhagavan only. Everything exists within Bhagavan, is pervaded over by Bhagavan. But it is this emphasis on this nature of Jivatman being repressed in its ability to experience pure Ananda, that they make their distinction. Their way of worshipping Sriman Narayana is very different. Dvaita's way of worshipping Sriman Narayana is very different. Other Vaishnavas worship in a different way. Now, if you come to the Nimbarka Sampradaya, they are called Dvaita Dvaita. This Sampradaya was brought into prominence by an Acharya called Nimbarka Acharya. This Acharya, he said that both the Dvaita, the Veda between Jivatma and Paramatma, as well as those parts where the Veda talks about the lack of difference between the two of them, we accept both in equal measure, and it is in both these aspects of being very similar to the Jivatman as well as being completely different from it. So this entirety of creation is constantly going on. They have certain small differences with the other. See, at the face of it, all the Vaishnava schools, they sound very similar. Their core philosophy, if you see, it will be almost the same only. Almost the same it will be. But it will be in the way they view things, the way they choose to conduct their daily worship to Bhagavan, and the way in which they see the dynamics between Jivatma and Paramatma. There only the main difference will come. Now, these philosophical differences, although they look very small, when they get applied in application, they'll become very, very huge. At an applied sense, they'll be very huge. We'll see what that means. Then you finally have the more famous Sampradaya that ISKCON claims to be upholding today, Gaudiya Sampradaya, Gaudiya, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu Sampradaya. Its Siddhanta is known as Achintya Bheda Bheda. Achintya Bheda Bheda, the name itself suggests that the Bheda, the difference between Jivatman and Paramatman, and the Abheda, the similarity between Jivatman and Paramatman, and the way in which Bhagavan maintains this relationship with the Jivatman is fundamentally Achintya, unthinkable. It is beyond our comprehension. We should only show Dasyatva to Sri Krishna, and therefore, therein we make our mark as a separate Sampradaya. Now, the ways in which their worship will be different, the ways in which their people get initiated will be different, the ways in which they wear their Urdhva Pundra, terminology that we keep using hereafter more regularly, refers to the three-line symbol which Vaishnavas wear, the U shape with a line in the middle. Broadly speaking, the Urdhva Pundra basically represents Bhagavan's 2 feet, the two white lines on the two sides are Bhagavan's 2 feet, and the flame of Shri in the middle, Lakshmi in the middle. Broadly, that's what it represents. Different Sampradayas wear it differently. Madhvas wear it in a kind of an ovalish shape. It looks like a lotus stem. In Shri Vaishnavas, there are two schools. One that will wear it in a white U shape with a yellow line in the middle, known as Uttarakalariya, followers of Vedanta Desika. Whereas the more popularly known shape in which you see the Vaishnava Urdhva Pundra, that is, if you see the Statue of Unity, the way in which Ramanuja's Urdhva Pundra is made over there, or if you go to Tirupati and if you see the way in which Balaji's Urdhva Pundra is, that V shape with a flat bottom, a stem in the bottom, and a red line in the middle. Dakshina Kalarya Shri Vaishnavas wear their Urdhva Pundra in that way. if you see Nimbarkas, their Urdhva Pundra will be this, it will be like this lotus, it will be like a lotus basically. The two side lines will be kind of bent in a very slender way, in a sideways way, and they'll meet at the bottom in a U shape. And in the middle, you won't have a line, you will have just a black dot. That is the Nimbarka Sampradaya. ISKCON's way of wearing Urdhva Pundra is how Gaudiyas wear it. A yellow stem of Gopi Chandana below with two forks going upwards on either side. That is ISKCON's way. They have their own initiation rites. Sri Vaishnavas undergo something called Pancha Samskara. The symbols of Bhagavan, the Shankha and Chakra Mudra, will respectively on your left and right shoulder, they will be burnt into your shoulder using a hot silver tongue. A sacred silver tongue that has been passed on from Acharya to Shishya from time to time. It will be burnt. You will be given a Dasya Nama. You have to identify yourself as a Ramanuja Dasa using that particular name. You have to wear Urdhva Pundra across 12 different parts of your body in a particular way. You will be taught that during that ceremony. You will be given the right to recite something called the Ashtakshara mantra and the Dvaya mantra and the Charama Shloka of Bhagavad Gita. And ultimately, you will be asked to go and conduct either Shalagrama Puja or in some cases of some Vaishnavas known to me, they will be asked to take care of cows. 5 samskaras. Tapaha Pundra Tata Nama Mantro Yagascha Panchamaha. 5 samskaras. Tapaha, burning the symbols of Bhagavan on your shoulder. Pundra, Urdhva Pundra Dharanam. Wearing the symbol of Bhagavan across your body. Nama, taking a name. For example, my name is Nagaraja Ramanujadasan. Like that, you can take some other name also. Shatagopa Ramanujadasan. Parthasarathi Ramanujadasan, you will be given a Dasya Nama to show your servitude to Bhagavan and the lineage of Acharyas who have, in whose lineage the Acharya who has given you Samashrana Diksha is now coming. You have to show your servitude to them. It's called Dasya Nama, name of servitude. Ashtakshara mantra, the right to recite Ashtakshara mantra, and Dvaya mantra. 4th samskara, that is. Yaga, 5th samskara. Worshipping of cows, Shalagrama particularly, and conducting various acts of Aradhana in your house. Every day morning, you should get up and you should sing certain parts of the Divya Prabandha revealed by the Alvas. If you are a Yagnopavitadhari, you should recite at least one sukta of the Vedas. You should go and bathe in a certain way. You should recite certain mantras while bathing if you are a Dvija. If you are an Advija, you should say certain other prayers, non-mantra prayers when you are bathing. This way of practicing that particular tradition of sampradaya in everyday life is what makes up society ultimately. That is how Vaishnava society was also at the beginning of Kaliyuga. For Madhvas, it will be something very similar. It will be. They will also have the symbols of Bhagavan burnt into their hands. I don't know whether it's the shoulder or somewhere in their arm. I'm not sure, but they do have it burnt into their hands. They will also wear in some 12 different parts of their body. They will also wear the Urdhva Pundra. The shape in which they wear it will be different. It will be oval with a black center. It will be looking like a lotus. They also will have a Dasya Nama. They will also have a way of reciting, they will have Ashtakshara mantra as well as a way of doing yaga every day. And every Acharya's household will tell you to do that Aradhana in a certain way. Aradhana refers to the daily puja in a certain way. One Acharya will tell you, take some warm water and bathe the Shaligrama Vigraha while reciting this particular sukta of the Vedas. One Acharya will tell you it is enough if you take Ashtakshara mantra and if you recite, if you do that particular rite, it's enough. One Acharya will tell you something like after doing this, you have to sing a certain set of shlokas that were revealed by these Acharyas, those Alvas, etc. There will be one way every Acharya will tell you to live. Then if you're a Dvija, you'll have to undertake your daily duties of Sandhya Vandana, etc. So Varna to Varna, the same Sampradaya will translate in different ways. These kinds of Vaishnavas existed all across Bharatavarsha. Typically, if you want to know the life of one person of the Vaishnava, of the first Varna, of the Brahmana Varna, how his life will be, I will narrate what kind of life would have been led by a typical Brahmana of the very beginning of Kali Yuga, following one of these Vaishnava Sampradayas. It wouldn't be very different for a Vaidika Shaiva, by the way. Typically, I'll just recite how the life of a very typical Brahmana would have been. They will get up before sunrise, sometime like 3:30 in the morning. By modern time standard, sometime like 3:30 they will have to get up. Either from the well or from the lake or from a river, preferably a river running water. They will have to go and bathe. They will come back before sunrise. They will finish doing their Urdhva Pundra Dharana. They will finish doing their Sandhya Vandana. Ideally, in one day, a Brahmana will be told, with every Sandhya Vandana, do at least try to do 108 Gayatri Japas. If you are not able to do 108, try to do a lesser number 28 or try to do 10, something like that. A very ideal Brahmana of those days. He would have done with every single Sandhya Vandana, he would have done 1008 Gayatris. 1008 into 3 is how much? 3024 Gayatri Japas in one day he will do. With every passing Sandhya, thrice a day he will keep doing it. Once that is over, once Arghya Pradhana and Sandhya Vandana is over, he will take his Diksha Patra and he will have to go into the villages, the towns. He will go around announcing, I'm coming for Bhiksha, please give me something. Some days people who are in a good mood, they will give him something more. Some days people will give him something less. He has to put up with it. He will take it and he will come back. By the time he gets back, it will be somewhat sun and all would have risen. It will be morning time. The folk in his house, there could be anyone, ranging from the women folk of his house to his shishyas, to people of other varnas who serve him, either as a shishyas or in some other as a cook or whoever, if he has someone like that. Some brahmanas who live in utter isolation won't even have that. They won't have shishyas and all to support them. They have to do it by themselves. They will have to make that food in a particular way. That kitchen in that house has to be in a particular way. That's why Brahmanas, that's why all Trivarnikas in their households, in the olden day households, if you go even today, the kitchen will be one very secret corner. Unwanted people's eyes shouldn't fall on the food. In that kitchen, only some people will be allowed to make food. In the case of a very pietistic Vaishnava, he will allow only Dikshadhari Vaishnavas to go into the kitchen. That is Vaishnavas of his Sampradaya who have taken Diksha, initiation into their Sampradaya. Initiation is basically the rites I just mentioned, like Pancha Samskara or whatever. He will not allow anyone else to even set foot in there. By the time that the preparation of that food is over, back in those days, you will have to grind the grain physically with your own hand. Vedanta Desika's wife was known to do this very well. She, it seems, used to start reciting the 4,000 Divya Prabandhas of the Alvas when she started pounding the rice. And by the time she finished cooking, she would have finished reciting all 4,000 Divya Prabandhas. It used to take that long, some 3-4 hours it will take. By the time the man, the Brahmana in question, he has to make a Tulasi Mala, he has to make a mala of lotus petals, depending on what day it is. If it is a Dwadasi, then he can't pluck Tulasi on that day. He will have to go gather some other offering. He has to go to a temple or to the Archa at his house, the Vigraha at his house itself. He has to do an elaborate Aradhana. A very pietistic Brahmin will do that Aradhana itself for like 2 hours. It will involve recitation of Vedas. It will involve doing some feeding of the cows around his house. Then after that, it will involve recitation of various prabandhas, various other slokas that he has learned from his own guru, etc. After this, he will do Brahma Yajna. After that, he will do Agnihotra if he is married, if he is a Grihastha. Agnihotra is he will light on fire. Ideally, the fire should have never died out. Ideally, when he gets married and when he becomes a Grihastha, he will light a fire in one place in his house, and that fire should be kept burning perennially. It should keep burning till the end of his life. He will go into Agnihotra to that fire. After Agnihotra, he will feed all the guests and all who come to his house in order. There's an order for that. If your Acharya came home the day, you should feed him first. If a sannyasi came home the day, you should feed him first. Sannyasi will not come into your house. There are rules in that. He will stand on the street. You should go give him food outside. You will wonder, he himself came begging. How is he going to share? That is how it was. Life was in those days. He has to go give the sannyasa outside. Sannyasi will not, he will come only into two parts of your house. He will either come to the outside courtyard of your house, or he will go straight to the where your Bhagavan's Vigraha is kept. He will never come inside the interior chambers of your house, the living room, the bedroom. He will not come anywhere else. The reason for that was, the ethic behind that was, if you welcome the sannyasi into your home and you showed on the luxury in which you are living, even if for a moment, for some reason, if the sannyasi thought something like, I left all this and I've taken a life of austerity and poverty. Now I feel a little bad seeing all this. Even if for a moment he thought of that, that sin will come to you. Hence, Sannyasi will himself not come into the house. And people themselves, the sannyasi is coming itself, they will get a call from one of the people at the end of that street in that village that sannyasi is coming. Someone will shout. They will all stand with their whatever food they have, their how much ever they are able to give, they will stand with it waiting outside. After this only, he will go to eat his meal. He will effectively eat one meal of the day well past midday. Oh wait, then he has to do Madhyanika Sandhya. A very pietistic Brahmana will do Madhyanika Sandhya with 1008 Gayatri Japas. Then he will sit down to eat. Through the afternoon, for all you know, he might do various other duties. He might teach people some suktas. He might teach them Itihasa Purana. He might teach them Vyakarana. He will do various other duties throughout the rest of the afternoon. By evening time, he'll usually go bathe one more time. He will visit the temple during the closing hours. He will eat his meal before the meal that was prepared in the morning. It has to get over the same day. That is another Shastra rule. You're not supposed to store food. He'll finish the remainder of the meal that they had cooked in that day's morning. He'll finish it before sunset. The last remnants of the food, he has to roll it using his hand into small balls of rice, recite some mantras over it so that all the deed of all the good karma that he has done that one day, some of it goes into that food and he has to leave it outside for crows and wild animals like dogs and all. When they come and eat, they will partake of the phala of his Gayatri Japa, his Agnihotra, his Sandhya Vandana, his Brahma Yajna, a little bit of that Punya Karma will go to those animals. This is how a Brahmana used to live in that day. Next day morning, rinse and repeat. This is how a Brahmana used to live. The Kshatriya's life will not be very different, except that he will not ask Bhiksha. He will be one of the people giving Bhiksha. He will also wake up very, very early in the morning like the Brahmana, as early as the Brahmana. Very pietistic Kshatriya will live very similar to a Brahmana, except that he will not go on Unchavritti. He will not go and ask Bhiksha. He will wait till the Brahmana comes. He will ask all the people in his house. He will typically live he's a governor of a land, so he'll have people, other families living inside his quarters itself. He will tell all the people in his house, whoever has to go and cook, whoever has to go and prepare the stable of the horse that day, whoever has to go and prepare the cow shed for the day. They will all have a routine instruction. Kshatriya, when he wakes up in the morning, after he does his Nitya Karma, that is, after he does his Sandhya Vandana, after he finishes whatever his samskaras are, he will instruct the more pietistic Kshatriyas I'm talking about. He will basically carry out the Aradhana of Bhagavan in a much more grand scale because he's richer. And when he carries out an Aradhana of Bhagavan in his house, the entire town will attend that Aradhana. He will take a procession through the town. He will give gifts throughout the town. This is what Rama, Dasharatha and all used to do. That's why it is said in Ramayana and all that every single day people used to keep getting some good thing from the king. Every single day the king will be in a very generous mood. He will give them something. He will give them something or the other. He will go around distributing during the Aradhana itself. He will give some things to all the various people in the town. After that is over, whatever food and all has been prepared, he'll have to wait and give bhiksha to the brahmanas who come, to the sannyasis who come. The more pietistic Kshatriyas will send messengers to various parts of their provinces. They will go into the forest, they'll go into all the remote places, the mountains and all. They'll call Kshatriyas, they'll call sannyasis, they will call other brahmanas from their ashramas and all, and they will bring them to the palace. They'll bring them on palanquin. They will arrange somewhere to bring them and then they will sit them down and they will eat. They'll give them food. After that, only the said Kshatriya will start eating itself. So during his entire the daily Aradhana procession, he can do various things. He can arrange for an elephant to be decorated and he can keep the Utsava Murti on top of that and he can take it around the town. He can do that if he wants. If he's able to afford it, he can do it. Sky is the limit. But the rest of the day, once all the guests, all the Atithis have gone, he will sit down to eat his first meal. Parallelly, administrative duties will keep going on. If you see in Ramayana, whenever Dasharatha was going to various places to, when he's going to a temple or whenever he's going to do a yajna or whenever he's going to sit down with some rishis, behind him a group of ministers will keep whispering something into his ear. So simultaneously, when these things are going on, he will keep issuing orders for administration also. He has to do this in parallel. The rest of the day is similar. The rest of the afternoon and all, he will go touring the country. He will go on horseback. He'll go to various places, he will tour all his troops, he will inspect his armies, he will do all that. And by the time he comes back, it will be well into the evening. He will also do his Sayam Sandhya. The more pietistic Kshatriya will have to eat before sunset. Next day, rinse and repeat. The more pietistic Vaishya. The Vaishya, he will not have administrative duties. The beginning of this Yuga, the Vaishya ideally would have been an agriculturalist, he would have been a farmer, or he would have been a tradesman doing a trade very closely related to agriculture. So every day morning when he gets up and he also has Yajnopavita, so he should also do Sandhya Vandana. And when he does his whatever Aradhana, he will not do Bhiksha. He also has the duty of waiting for the Brahmanas to come and take Bhiksha at his doorstep. He has to give some Bhiksha to them. When he starts his trade, if it is agriculture, there is a way in which he has to go to his cow shed and he has to wake up the cows. Cows are sacred animals. We will see later on why cows are sacred. He has to wake up the cows in a certain way. There will be a way, a respectful way to do that. You can't just go and kick them awake and all. No, you cannot do that. You will go to Naraka if you do that. You have to wake them up in a respectful way. You have to ask, either you do it or you'll have to ask one of the people of your family to take the cows for grazing. There is a way to do it. The pietistic members of the four Varnas will not give religious duties to someone outside of their Sampradaya. That is, a Kshatriya will not ask someone to cook in his kitchen if he is also not of the same Sampradaya as the Kshatriya. He has to be of the same Sampradaya. Same for the Vaishya. He will not ask someone to be his herdsman if that person has not taken Diksha in his Sampradaya. After that, he will organize. Many Vaishyas will do Go Puja also. They will do a puja for the cow and they will ensure that all the calves drink their fill of milk. The residual milk they get, they will take a share of that for Aradhana for the day to prepare the prasada of their house. He will simultaneously have to do the trade. Now, his trade can be various. There are certain trades only allowed for a Vaishya. In Manushastra, for example, will say a Vaishya and a Brahmana should strictly keep one thing in mind: never sell milk for a living. Never sell milk. If you sell milk, you will lose your Varna status. It's a sin to sell milk. Why? Cow is a sacred animal. Whatever comes out of the cow is prasada. If you sell prasada for a price, all your punya phalas will evaporate. You are not supposed to sell milk. Now, don't ask what dairy farms are doing. What dairy farms are doing is wrong only. Milk is a free commodity. It was a community commodity. After the calves are finished drinking milk, there is a way in which you have to go and they will. Anushasana Parva of Mahabharata says you have to go in front of the cow and you have to beg the cow in a certain way. Please give me the residual milk. And in those days they said a cow which will understand what you're asking will turn around and show you its udder. She will show you her udder and she will stand over there till you take milk. That is a very ideal way. The idealistic way of milking the cow is this. That residual milk, whatever comes, you will take a bit of it and keep it for Aradhana in your house, making the food of your house for that day. You will supply the remaining freely to the town, not at a price. Free. It is given to the town, it's distributed to everyone else. You might be doing some other trade. You might be running a weaving unit as a Vaishya. You might have a land where crops are grown and various farmers of your Varna and of the Shodra Varna are working on it. You'll have to go and inspect your trade after the rest of the day. Bare minimum for a pietistic Vaishya, this is. What will a Shudra do? The Shudra will basically be helping all these other three people do their work properly. Plus, he will do an ancestral trade office. Shudras don't have Yajnopavita, so they don't have this get up and do Sandhyavana. That is not there for them. No Brahma Yajna, no Agnihotra. Vaishyas also will have to do Agnihotra. Kshatriyas who are married will also have to do Agnihotra. That's not there for Shudra. So what will Shudra do? He will also get up. He will also have to go bathe in a river. That is common for all Chaturvarnya. He will not do Veda related activities. What will he do? He will do some small Nama Sankirtana in his house. And normally, the more pietistic Shudra, he will be doing some work for the other three Varnas. For a Brahmana, he might be his cook. He might be the keeper of his ashrama. He might be the Brahmana's one Shishya doing some work for him. Shudras would also be Brahmana Shishyas who also do some work for them. They'll be taught things like Itihasa Purana, all those things. And they'll be doing some work for them. the more elderly people of that Varna, they will have some ancestral trade, something like they will do all the most material trades they will only do. Being a blacksmith, being a tax collector, being soldiers. Kshatriya's armies were made of people in the fourth Varna, being soldiers, being provincial law keepers, even doing something simply like going and working on a farm, being a herdsman, sculpting, painting, acting, all these things, all the service related things. They will only be the ones who work on the estates of the Vaishyas, Kshatriyas, etc. They will be given by law of the land, they will have a permanent plot over there, which their lineage will keep inheriting generation after generation. They will all gather over there. When that Brahmana comes, they also have to come and give Bhiksha. Shudra should give Bhiksha because Shudra is allowed to earn a material living. He is allowed to have a very big house. Brahmanas are allowed to live only in a small house with nothing. A Shudra can grow rich and wealthy using this trade. A Brahmana will have to be a pauper. That is what Manu Shastra says. So at the beginning of Kaliyuga, more or less society would have been like this only. It was not very different for Shaivas, Vaidika Shaivas. It was pretty much the same. Just the daily, the deeds, the duties that they perform. In that, some agamic differences will come. Okay. Now, this is how broadly society was back then. How society is today, you think about it. Now, what have we listed? We'll see some sources of Shaiva lore. When we say lore, folklore compiled into texts. What kind of life existed? So back then in those days, when the Alvars were incarnating at the beginning of Kali Yuga, the Nayanmars also of the Shaivas incarnated. What is the fundamental difference of the Alvars and Nayanmars? We need to understand a very important fundamental difference. Oftentimes, we as Hindus we treat that they are all saints. We say, oh, there's one saint, that's one saint. Okay. But the standards of sainthood itself are very different for both. The Alvar will follow something that the Vedas say in a particular way. Whereas the Nayanmar will follow something that the Shaiva Agamas say in a particular way. If you take the life of Tirujnana Sambandha from the Periya Purana, that introductory part alone, we'll see today, it tells you a very ideal overview of the life of, not just the life of Tirujnana Sambandha, it also tells you how life itself was in general in the Chola country for much of this Yuga till date. Now, Tirujnana Sambandha was born in a province known as Sirgadi. In those days, the Shaiva belief is that at the beginning of Kali Yuga, various Shiva Ganas, who are faithfully bhaktas of Shiva and Parvati, started incarnating on Bhuloka in order to show people the way of worshipping Shiva, Jnana Sambandha being one such person. Now, typically, in the life of a Shaiva, how would life be? They will also have this getting up in the morning and doing some bathing in a river body. But they would have certain rights that Vaishnavas, what we saw so far, they will not have. For example, a Shaiva, he will do something called Tripundra Dharana and Bhasma Snana, depending on his Agama. Typically, a Shaiva, he gets up in the morning, he will go bathe in the river, he will take a vibhuti of Bhasma that has been taken out of the fire of a yajna that has been offered in honor of Shiva. So basically, when a Shaiva makes an offering, he has to make a fire, he has to give some offerings in that fire, and the Bhasma that comes out of it, he has to smear that in various parts of his body. The way in which he will do it will slightly vary according to which tradition of Shaivism they follow. Now, Shaivism has various schools we will see in history. Pashupata, Kapalika, Kalamukha, Lakulisha. So many schools are there. But back in the era of the Nayanmars, we are talking sometime about 5,000 years ago, 5 to 6,000 years ago, you did not have very coherent distinctions between these schools. They were all known broadly Shaiva only. Now you should note, why am I now saying that the Alvars, Nayanmars, incarnated in the first 3000 years of Kaliyuga, the first 4000 years of Kaliyuga, whereas modern historians will tell you 9 months existed 1400 years ago and Alvars existed 1300 years ago. There's a fundamental difference in reasoning. The modern historian will go into the textual sources and the kind of language used. He will see the kind of language used in Periya Purana, the kind of language used across various Shaiva Agamas, the kind of Sanskrit or Tamil used in various Shaiva texts. And he will say, an inscription exists from that particular part of Tamil Nadu, which is this old and that uses this kind of language. Therefore, this text is from that particular period of time. There is a very, very big problem in this way of reasoning. Dating an inscription using radiocarbon dating itself, it has anything from 20 to 50% of an error rate. You really can't say in many cases how old an inscription is. One part of the rock itself will be older, one part of the rock will be younger. Who scribbled on it when can't be said for a certainty. But when you're taking a text that has been passed on, what are you going to use in order to check the date of that thing? If a text is written in a really old parchment paper, okay, you can at least try to find out the age of the parchment paper. But these were not texts that were typically written on old parchments alone. They were also written on parchments at other periods of time. Before that, they were passed orally. They were passed as a recitation because the people of the Brahmana Varna, be they Vaishnavas or Shaivas, had only that duty, the duty of memorizing and passing things down verbatim. How can you tell what is the age of something that was recited? You really can't do it. The second thing is the peculiarity between the languages Sanskrit and Tamil. A very huge peculiarity is there in these two languages. How Tamil sounded 5,000 years ago is how Tamil sounded 1,000 years ago also. There was no difference. The poetic Tamil in which the Nayanmars wrote was also the poetic Tamil in which Alvars wrote. Tirumangai Alvar, in the kind of Tamil he sang praises of Sriman Narayana. Manikya Vachakar used similar kind of Tamil grammar to sing praises of Shiva and Parvati. Jnana Sambandar used the same kind of Tamil. Thirumolar used the same kind of Tamil. Sirutondar used the same kind of Tamil. They all use the same kind of Tamil. But they all lived at wildly different times. The kind of language is the same. Tirumangai Alvar and Manikya Vachaka lived in the same time period. Whereas various other Nayanmars like Sirutondar, Manakancharar, they all lived in various different times. Between Periyalvar and Tirumangai Alvar itself, there is nearly 1,000 years of difference or something. But both their Prabandhas, if you read and say, the kind of Tamil is the same. The thing is, when it comes to the Alvars, we have very accurately a nakshatra on which they celebrate their Avatara Kala. It's their Avatara Nakshatra. Till date, Sri Vaishnavas very, very diligently have kept track of this particular Alvar, this Avatara Nakshatra, so many days since the start of Kali. Linguistic dating of a text is almost never going to possibly give you, it's almost never going to give you an accurate result. Not just for Sanskrit and Tamil text, you can do it even on a Greek text, it cannot work. You will not see a difference between the kind of Greek Byzantines used and the kind of Greek Homer used. It will not be different. It will be very, very similar. In fact, it will be the same. Maybe in religious terms, when they start talking, Homer will use the word God in plural, whereas Byzantines who lived 1,400 years ago, they will use the word God in singular only. Because for them, by the time they were Christians, they believed in one God only. Apart from those minute differences, the grammar will be the same, choice of words will be the same. When they're going to praise something, it will be the same. When they're going to curse something, it will be the same. Same only it will be. Traditionally, Sanatanis do not accept modern historians' dating of their saints. Traditionally, Sanatanis will go only by what their Guru Paramparas have established. Which is why, if you go to Wikipedia, you'll see Nammalvar lived 1,300 years ago. Whereas for us, Nammalvar appeared on Goloka 43 days after the beginning of Kaliyuga. Most acharyas today agree that Kaliyuga is between 5 and 6,000 years. We are between 5 and 6,000 years into Kaliyuga. So approximately some 5,100 years or something ago, or 5,130 years or something ago, Nammalvar Swami appeared. That is what we believe. Shaivas believe something very, very similar about their 9 Mars. So when we are going to look at the beginning of Kaliyuga, the kind of lives Alvars and 9 Mars led is authoritative enough to tell you what is the social scenario in the beginning of Kaliyuga. You have to take some places with a pinch of salt because the author, like Sekira, he in many places has put his own bias in the time when Sekira was living. The Cholas were falling to the Pandyas. The Pandyas were overthrowing the Cholas. So he shows in his book, originally the Cholas were great, but now look, the Pandyas have become great. He anachronistically imposes the social dynamics of his timeline onto the timeline of 9 Mars. But when he talks about the religious dynamics of the 9 Mars timeline, it is pretty accurate because it's corroborated by Buddhist sources. Okay. We have to also know the methodology that we are using. So a very pietistic Shaiva, he will do something called bathing himself in ash if he follows something called the Pashupata Vrata. Now, using of this Vibhuti, it looks very simple for most Hindus today, but in itself, using of Vibhuti has a very, very, very long and a very peculiar history, in fact, and a very interesting history. There is a part known as Sutta Samhita in Skanda Purana. It tells you something called Pashupata Vrata. Now, the Shaiva, if you look at the beliefs of the Shaiva's beliefs will be very similar to the Vaishnava's beliefs in that era. They will also say everything Brahma created everything. Brahma came from the body of a Paramatman. They will also say that everything is a Jivatman. Those Jivatmans are all eternally dependent on Bhagavan. But when you ask who is Bhagavan to a Shaiva, he's going to say Shiva and Uma only. Rudra and Uma are only Bhagavan. That's what he's going to say. A Vaishnava will say Shri and Narayana. If you see a Shaiva Brahmin, the way in which he does Sandhyavandana will be very different. His conception of Brahmanatva will be very, very different. They have very different conception. They have very different idea of sannyasa also. Some of the Shaiva sannyasis, they will remove off their Yajnopavita. Some won't. Okay. But one commonality between all Shaivas was that they accepted a mixture of the Agamas and Vedas. So they will, what you see about creation in the Vedas, how human society was formed in the Vedas, all that Shaivas will accept. But when you ask them what is the identity of this Paramatman, they will go to their Agamas for it. If you see the Atharva Shiras Upanishad, that is a Shaiva Upanishad, and the Sutta Samhita, tells you why exactly Shaivas use the Tripundra. The Shaivas consider the Bhasma that comes from a Yajna fire of Shiva as a means to achieving enlightenment. Point number one. That has to be put on your body while reciting certain mantras mentioned inside these Upanishads. The second thing is, they also believed that everything exists. In other words, they believed that everything is a real existence. That is, you are real, I am real, etc. There's a reason why I say this. Because back in those days, you had sects of Buddhists and Jainas who basically believed that everything is an illusion of some. You had certain sects of Jainas who believed that, but mostly Buddhists who believed that everything is an illusion. Back then itself, Shaivas and Bauddhas, they were very bitter enemies of one another. This is reflected in Sekira's writing. Shaivas and Jainas, Bauddhas and Jainas, they all had mutual extreme levels of animosity between each other. And the result and the reason for that is fundamentally these religions are itself different religions. Jainas and Bauddhas are Nastikyavadis. They don't believe in the existence of a Paramatman itself. Whereas Shaivas and Vaishnavas, they believe in the existence of a Paramatman. See, from that point of view, the very basis of life for a Shaiva is anathema to a Buddhist, and vice versa. A Buddhist will say you have to cease doing all work and you have to just sit and meditate on the spiritual nothingness beyond the conscience because anyway nothing exists. A Shaiva will say by saying this I'm committing blasphemy because I'm saying basically Shiva doesn't exist. I'm saying my life itself is actually non-existent. I'm saying that all the deeds that have been preached by Shiva through my Agamic Shaiva Sutras, They are all non-existent. You're basically calling my God a lie. So back then itself, Bauddhas and Jainas used to live more outside the cities and towns. Their ideas were not accepted as mainstream. They were more fringe. If you see in Tiruvnyana Sambandha's life, and if you see in the text known as Manimeka, like the Sangamera text, you will see Bauddhas and Jainas, they don't live in mainstream cities for the most part of their history. They live in mountain caves, hill caves, forest groves. They are called as economically people who don't do any work. They are people who have left their families. They are people who have gone away from society itself. They have basically wandered off into the wilderness in search of something they call as nirvana. There are very, very high amounts of similarity between Bauddhas and Jainas to the extent that foreigners could not tell the difference many times. In the 3rd century, there was one chronicler sitting in Gaza. He was a Christian. His name was Porphyry. He wrote a book on vegetarianism. Let me just get the name of that book. Give me a minute. He wrote a very interesting book. He wrote a very interesting book known as on the benefits of vegetarianism. Yes, that's the name of the book. That book, he says that he has heard of a group of people known as Shramanas in India. Where did he hear of these people from? So Porphyry has wandered into cities like Edessa. He went into various cities of Syria. He went into various parts of Egypt. In all his travels, there are indications that he actually met Buddhist travelers from India in the 3rd century. And in the course of his meetings, he learned various things from them. He tells you very common things about them. He tells you that the Samanas of India have told me that the sect whom they consider to be their biggest enemy are a group of people known as Brahmanas. These people are fundamentally different from them because they believe in a god and they believe in having families. And they guide all non-Brahmanas also in a manner as to live their life according to marrying, having children, doing various societal work, activities, etc. Whereas the Samanas don't have a concept of family. The Samana, he has to do only meditation throughout the day and live off the bhiksha of others, and he really does not have anything in return. Now, why am I quoting Porphyry over here? Because there is a level of bias in all other texts. If you ask Sekidar about Jainas, he's going to say something bad about them. If you ask a Jaina about a Shaiva, he's not going to say something very good. But if you ask a total third person, the third person who has no vested interest, it's more likely that he got it right. Porphyry was a total third person, and Porphyry corroborates a lot of things that Sekidar himself says. He also corroborates a lot of things that Sitali Satana says in Manimekali. Porphyry says that these people, they abandon their families, they have no socially productive work, and they live in monasteries that have to be funded by kings. They have to live only a certain way of life. And in return for that way of life, the people who serve them believe that they will also get closer to some enlightenment. These are the Samanas. He writes in his book on the benefits of vegetarianism. There's a book that he wrote. In Greek, he wrote a book. Now, Sekidar describes a very similar kind of life. In those days, the Shaivas used to live according to the Varnashrama Dharma, which is preached in the 4 Vedas. The Brahmanas would live near the Shiva temple, in the Agrahara there. The Kshatriyas near the palace and all the more military places. Their communities will live there. The Vaishyas will live near the temples, Gopura, and the place where the cows are kept and on the fields. The Shudras will live alongside all of them in various places. This is how life was. Into the wilderness, if you go, you will find groups of Shamanas. Now, Shamanas used to come preaching back in those days itself into towns and exhorting people to take up Nastikya, atheism. Their arguments was, you worship a stone. The stone cannot do anything for you. You have so many superstitions. You believe that reciting these mantras are going to do something for you. You have so many various kinds of various beliefs of putting this vibhuti on your head. That's just burnt ash. What's that going to do for you? Because of this, there used to often be very violent uprisings between Shaivas and Jainas and Bauddhas in those days itself. In Sekirada's own time, not in Sekirada's time, in Jnana Sambandha's time, sometime near the beginning of Kaliyuga, maybe 2,000 years into Kaliyuga. Now, the psyche of the average Shaiva was it is complete blasphemy to believe in the lack of existence of not only Shiva but of Vishnu also.